Welcome to Ghost Lore Chronicles. Tonight, we uncover one of America's most terrifying legends, the Lady in White of Resurrection Cemetery, a ghostly figure who appears on dark roads, only to vanish at the gates. Turn down the lights and listen closely. If you enjoy this video, don't forget to like, share your thoughts in the comments, and spread the fear by sharing with your friends. And for more true, bone-chilling horror, make sure to subscribe to Ghost Lore Chronicles. I still can't fully understand whether that night was a dream or if it truly became part of my life. Sometimes I tell myself I must have imagined it all. But then a cold shiver crawls down my spine, because some things were far beyond imagination. My name is Daniel. I was born and raised in Chicago. I work for a small construction company, often getting home late at night. Living in this city, you hear all kinds of stories, strange, terrifying stories. And among them, the most famous one is about the Lady in White, a young woman dressed in white who appears near Resurrection Cemetery. They say late at night, drivers pick her up. She quietly sits inside the car. But once the vehicle reaches the cemetery gates, she vanishes without a trace. I grew up hearing these tales. To be honest, I never believed them. I always thought, just old ghost stories, nothing real. But after that night, my belief was shattered forever. It was close to midnight when I was driving home. The job site was far away, and I had to take Archer Avenue, the road that passes right by Resurrection Cemetery. It was a cold winter night, the streets nearly empty. My car's heater was humming, and outside, a heavy fog was rolling in. That's when I saw her, a girl, dressed in white. Long hair, pale face. She was standing on the roadside, as if waiting for someone to stop. At first, I thought maybe she'd been in an accident, or her car had broken down. I slowed down, rolled the window halfway, and called out, "Hey, are you okay? Do you need a ride somewhere?" She slowly lifted her head. Her eyes looked strange, like mist had clouded them. For a second, my heart jumped, but I steadied myself. Without a word, she opened the back door and slipped inside. "Where to?" I asked. Her voice was barely a whisper. "Near Resurrection Cemetery." The words unsettled me. She really wanted to go there? I hesitated for a moment, but kept driving. Inside the car, silence thickened. The only sounds were the heater and the thud of my heartbeat. Glancing into the rearview mirror, I saw her staring out the window. Her lips were moving, but no sound came out, like she was murmuring to herself, some kind of prayer or something else. The air inside the car began to change. Even with the heater on, it felt colder, as if frost were seeping in through invisible cracks. As we neared the cemetery gates, it happened. I looked in the mirror again. She was gone. The seat was empty. No sound of the door opening, no movement. She had simply vanished. My hands froze on the wheel. I slammed the brakes, pulling over in shock. My eyes darted around the car. Nothing. Just the swirling fog outside and the looming iron gates of Resurrection Cemetery, with rows of old gravestones stretching into the dark. That was the first moment I truly understood. Those stories I had dismissed all my life weren't just myths. And it wasn't the end. That single ride was only the beginning of a nightmare I would never escape. The next morning, I woke up before my alarm, the image of the empty back seat still burning behind my eyelids. Daylight should have made the whole thing ordinary, rationalized, explained away. But sunlight only sharpened the edges of the memory. I couldn't get past the feeling that I'd carried something back in my car that night, something that had no business being real. At work, I tried to act normal. I hauled plywood, tightened bolts, made small talk about lunch and weather. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw that pale face and the fog swallowing the cemetery gate. By noon, I couldn't stand it. I called my sister, Marianne. "Hey," she said, like a sound that belonged to someone who hadn't been up half the night with ghosts. "I need to tell you something," I said before I could stop myself. I told her the story, slowly, clumsily, about the girl in white, about the way the air had gone cold, about her vanishing without a door slam or a footstep. There's a kind of cadence to how people react to ghost stories. Some laugh, some go quiet. Marianne's voice went small and careful. Mom used to talk about resurrection, she said finally. When we were kids, she would warn us not to take late buses past there. Said a woman in white sometimes stands on Archer. Said she hesitated. Said she was waiting. It was the kind of thing you expected from our mother, who braided caution into every story. But hearing it pulled something else loose. Maybe it wasn't just me. Maybe the city kept pockets of the old stories, and they woke up when the fog thickened. That afternoon I did what I usually do when I can't sleep and can't stop thinking about something. I went looking for proof. Not supernatural proof. I'm not that brave, but for facts. If I could find a newspaper clipping, an old blog post, anything that anchored the story in time, I told myself I'd feel less foolish. The main library downtown smelled like dust and quiet authority. I sat at a long table under a skylight and dug into microfilm and old city papers. For hours I traced obituaries and court notes and the kind of small arrests and tragedies that newspapers never quite forget. I found references to Resurrection Cemetery, land transfers, cemetery expansions, an article from the 60s about a rare storm, but nothing explicitly about a woman appearing in white. What I did find, tucked into a column of letters to the editor from 1987, was one paragraph that made my hands go cold. A reader wrote about picking up a pale lady near Archer Avenue. How she asked the driver to stop by the iron gates and then disappeared. The driver quit his route a week later, he said, and no one could find him. The letter was terse and anonymous. That was it. No details, no name, no photograph. Just the idea that someone else had seen something like I had. Frustration made me reckless. I drove to the cemetery that afternoon, in daylight, telling myself it was ridiculous. I told myself I would see only stone and grass, pigeons and rust. Resurrection's gates leaned open a little, mournful, and the groundskeeper's shack sat like a forgotten watchtower beyond a gravel drive. He was a man with a face the color of dried tobacco and hands thick from work. He was sweeping a line of leaves away from the gate when I pulled up. I don't know why I expected theater, the old man whispering the truth like a priest, but he answered with the bluntness of daily labor. "You lost?" he asked, without looking up. I saw something here last night," I said. Felt absurd to say aloud. "A woman, white dress. She got into my car and vanished." He stopped sweeping. For a second, there was only the scrape of the broom. "Folks tell tales," he said finally. "This place, it does that. Brings people back what they can't leave behind." "Did people really pick her up?" I asked. It felt small, a child asking if monsters live under a bed. He nodded. "Yeah. Cab drivers, folks heading home. Been stories as long as I remember. Some say she died young. Some say she was left at church and never claimed. Folks like a story, 'cause it gives places something to do when they don't know what else. But I reckon there's more to it if you ask me." "More?" My voice came out thin. He tapped the gate with the broom. "Some things in Resurrection don't like to be remembered clean. They come out when the city's lonely, when the fog rolls in and the lights cut down." I wanted names, dates, proof. He didn't have them. He gave me instead a small, folded pamphlet. Cemetery rules, hours, a list of notable burials, and on the back, a faded black and white photograph taped to the inside cover. It showed a group of people, maybe from the 1940s. Men in suits, women in hats, a child holding a bouquet. At the center, incongruously, was a young woman in white, smiling like a summer postcard. Someone had written a name beneath, but time had eaten most of the ink. All I could make out were the letters, E.A. "She's not listed," the groundskeeper said. "Odd, ain't it?" I drove home with the photograph taped to my dashboard, and I found myself looking at it the way you stare at an accident. The girl in the photo had the same long hair, the same way her collar sat high on her throat. Each time the traffic light turned red, I felt the steering wheel pulse under my hands, and my mouth dry up with questions I didn't know how to ask. That night, I couldn't bring myself to take Archer Avenue. Instead, I found a bar 2 blocks from my apartment and sat with a beer that tasted like nothing. Bars are good places for information, the kind of place where people let sentences fall apart and tell you the last thing they felt shame about. I talked to a bartender named Mark, who'd worked nights for years and had a conversational memory like a city map. "You picked her up?" he asked before I could form the words into a question. His voice was matter-of-fact, like he was finishing a sentence I'd left dangling. "I did," I said, "and she vanished." He didn't blink. "You're not the first to say that. Drivers leave things behind when they've been near resurrection. Sometimes it's a feeling. Sometimes it's a face. Folks think the afterlives like to borrow our backs for a minute." "Why would she get in my car?" I asked. "Why not walk?" He shrugged. "Maybe she wanted to go home. Maybe she doesn't know. Maybe it's a trick. Maybe—" He stopped, looked at me like he hadn't before. "You look like you need to know more than stories." I did. I needed to watch and to record, and to gather other people whose disbelief had eroded. So I started to do what people with questions do. I paid attention. I drove different routes. I stalled at intersections near the cemetery and watched the shoulders of the road when fog lay low. I took down license plate numbers of cars parked where they shouldn't be. I downloaded grainy forum threads where strangers shared their midnight sightings and compared notes. And then small, inexplicable things started following me. It began with my phone. Once, after midnight, I opened a text thread to find a single message. An image I had not saved. A blown-out photo of an empty back seat. No caption. No sender. The timestamp was the exact minute I'd driven past Resurrection. When I tried to trace it, it had no origin. My phone's gallery showed no such photo. It existed only in that message. Days later, I would arrive home to find a single white rose slipped under my windshield wiper. The petals were slightly browned, as if they'd been left out in the cold. No note, no fingerprints, just the echo, like someone trying out gestures they remembered from life. Each small thing tightened the knot in my chest. They weren't violent. There were no overt threats. But there was an insistence that I had been chosen for something or noticed. I couldn't decide which was worse. My sister suggested I stop telling people. "You're feeding it," she said. "These stories listen. But stories are how people put meaning around unknown things. In their absence, we invent silence." I couldn't live like that, walking around the city waiting for a ghost to set an appointment. I needed to know if what I'd seen was a fluke or a pattern. I set up a cheap camera in my trunk, pointed inward like a security cam. I told myself it was ridiculous. I told myself that cameras catch poles and glare and bugs. But I wanted to see. The first night I left the camera running, I hardly slept. When I checked the footage the next morning, the file was corrupted. I'd never had a corrupted file on that SD card before. The camera's timestamp showed it had recorded from 11:40 p.m. to 12:05 a.m., the exact time frame of my pickup. But when I scrolled through the footage, there were only pockets of static and a thudding white smear that made my head swim. Between static bursts, there was nothing at all. Just a darkness that didn't match the streetlights outside. I played it over and over until the smear stopped being static and started to look like fabric. A shape that moved with a graceless inevitability, like the end of a rope. I turned the speakers down because the noise made my teeth ache. When I couldn't take it anymore, I closed my laptop and breathed like someone waking from a dream. The city felt different after that, like a place where the ground could tilt underfoot. I started to notice other things I might have missed before. A woman at the bus stop who watched me a little too long. A dog on a leash that pulled toward the cemetery and whined like it remembered. A folding chair by a lamppost where someone had set a small porcelain doll with its head tilted. Small offerings, or the city's own nervous gestures. Most nights I wanted to pretend none of it meant anything. But in the hard hours before sleep, the photograph on my dashboard glowed in the streetlight and the letters under the girl's portrait, E and A, stared up at me like initials carved into bone. I kept going back to the cemetery, scanning for names, for anything to anchor her to a life. Every time I left, the fog swallowed the road like a hand. I began to keep a notebook, dates, times, weather, witnesses. I drew a map of where I'd picked her up. I wrote down every person who mentioned her in passing. It looked more and more like a case file than a journal. And as any case file will tell you, the more you track the edges of something, the more you expose the center. On the seventh night, someone else showed up on Archer Avenue. I saw them as I turned the corner. A man in his 20s, hunched over the curb, trying to thumb a cab. He looked up when I pulled over, relief and fatigue on his face. He climbed into my passenger seat without a question and asked, in a voice like cracked gravel, "Are you headed past the gates?" There are moments when your entire life narrows to a single decision. I could have kept driving. I could have refused a stranger and pretended not to notice. But I didn't. I drove. And for the first time since that night, when I glanced into the rear view, I saw the reflection of two things. Myself, older and smaller, and in the darkness behind, a flash of white. I didn't want to look again. My eyes locked on the road, on the shallow beams of my headlights cutting through fog. The stranger beside me drummed his fingers on his knees, restless, but I couldn't bring myself to ask him anything. My pulse hammered like the car's engine. Finally, against every instinct screaming in my head, I tilted the rearview mirror. She was there, the same pale face, the same white dress, as if she'd been waiting in the dark all along. She sat motionless, hands folded neatly in her lap. Her head was turned toward the passenger beside me, but he didn't react, didn't flinch, didn't even acknowledge her presence. "Do you see her?" I whispered, my throat dry. The man's eyes stayed fixed on the windshield. "Don't look at her too long," he muttered. His voice cracked like he'd said the words before, rehearsed them. "That's how they keep you." "Who is she?" I asked, though the question felt childish. His fingers dug into the worn fabric of the seat. "They call her Mary. Some say Anna. Doesn't matter. She died on this road years ago. Car wreck, maybe a fight, maybe worse. Nobody agrees. What matters is, she never left." He exhaled sharply. "Once you see her, you'll see her again. And again. Until she decides you don't get to look away." The words settled into me like stones dropped into water. I kept driving, the cemetery gates inching closer. I could see their outlines through the fog, black iron rising from the ground like ribs. My stomach twisted. I wanted to slam the brakes, to turn around, but some current stronger than fear pushed me forward. The man in the passenger seat began to hum. A low, tuneless sound, like someone trying to drown out noise only they could hear. "Don't stop the car," he said, barely audible. "Don't open the doors. Just keep moving." But before I could answer, the engine stuttered. The headlights flickered. My car slowed as though something had its hand on the hood, pressing down. "No," the man whispered, panic bleeding into his voice. He turned toward me, his face pale. "She doesn't want us to pass." I dared another glance into the rear view. She was closer now. Her hands weren't folded anymore. They were pressed against the back of the passenger seat, fingers bone white, knuckles sharp as stone. Her eyes met mine in the mirror, and I felt the bottom drop out of the world. It was like falling, like being pulled through glass. For a moment, I wasn't in my car at all. I was standing on a road slick with rain, headlights from another decade blazing behind me. A girl screamed, metal screamed louder, and the world folded into the sound of tearing steel. I saw her body thrown, saw her face streaked with blood and disbelief. Then I was back behind the wheel, heart slamming, sweat cold on my neck. The man beside me was shaking. "She showed you," he said hoarsely. "She picked you." The gates loomed ahead. My car crawled forward, tires crunching gravel. Couldn't breathe. And then, as suddenly as it had started, the engine surged. The lights brightened. I blinked and the back seat was empty. The man leaned back, breathing hard. "That's it," he said. "That's how it goes. She comes, she rides, she leaves. But it's never over. You'll dream her now. You'll find pieces of her where you shouldn't." I pulled over a mile down the road and sat shaking behind the wheel. The man opened the door and stepped into the fog without another word. I never saw him again. But that night, when I finally staggered home, the smell of wet earth clung to my clothes. On my kitchen table, where I knew I'd left nothing, lay a single folded slip of paper. My hands trembled as I opened it. 2 words, written in faint pencil. "Find me. Asterisk asterisk. I sat there at the table staring at those two words until the letters blurred. Find me. They didn't look rushed, like a desperate scrawl. The handwriting was delicate, almost old-fashioned, the kind you saw in love letters from decades ago. It made my stomach knot in ways I couldn't explain. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I was back on that wet road, watching the wreck play out. The sound of metal twisting echoed inside my skull. Around 3 in the morning, I caught myself whispering the words on the paper, like a chant. Find me. Find me. The next day, I carried the note in my pocket to work, unable to leave it behind. At lunch, I showed it to Marianne. She read it, her brow furrowed. Where did you get this? She asked. On my table, I said. My voice was hoarse. It wasn't there when I left for work. It wasn't there when I came in. It just appeared. Her face tightened. You need to stop. Stop driving past Resurrection. Stop talking about her. This isn't healthy. But even as she spoke, she reached for the paper again, running her thumb along the edge. Something in her eyes told me she was curious too, though she tried to hide it. That evening, I returned to the library. I searched for car accidents near Archer Avenue, deaths of young women in white dresses, funerals tied to Resurrection. First, it was dead ends. Obituaries without details, names without faces. But then I stumbled across an article from 1934. Tragedy strikes Archer Avenue. Young woman killed in collision. Asterisk. The article was brief, but the details chilled me. A girl named Elizabeth Anders, Betty to her friends, was struck while leaving a dance hall late one foggy night. She'd been wearing a white gown. She died instantly. Her family buried her at Resurrection Cemetery. Elizabeth Anders, initials E.A. The photograph the groundskeeper had shown me burned in my mind, the faded letters beneath the girl's smiling face. My hands shook as I copied down the article. This was her. It had to be. That night, I dreamt of her for the first time. I was standing outside the gates of the cemetery, fog curling around my feet. The iron bars towered above me, and through them I saw her. Not the bloody wrecked version from the vision in my car, but whole, untouched. She was smiling just as she had in the photograph. She raised her hand and pointed to the ground at her feet. When I looked down, the grass parted like curtains, revealing soil and stone. I woke drenched in sweat, the sheets twisted tight around me. On my nightstand lay another slip of paper, though I was certain I had gone to bed with nothing there. This one said, "Not here." Asterisk asterisk. I started keeping both notes folded together, tucked into my wallet. I couldn't tell if they were messages or taunts, but either way they guided me. The following weekend, I decided to retrace Elizabeth's last night. I drove Archer Avenue slowly, noting the old buildings, some now abandoned, others converted into corner bars or laundromats. I stopped at the site where the dance hall once stood. It was now an empty lot with cracked pavement and weeds pushing through. Standing there, I could almost hear the faint music, laughter from a party long extinguished. I spoke out loud, though I felt like an idiot. "Is this what you wanted me to find?" Silence answered. But when I turned back to my car, my breath caught. In the back seat, where no one should have been, lay a small, crumpled bouquet of white flowers. They were fresh, dew still clinging to the petals. I left the lot shaking, my mind a storm. She was leading me somewhere, showing me pieces, but to what end I couldn't grasp. That night, I interviewed Mark again at the bar. I told him about Elizabeth Anders, about the flowers. He listened without interrupting, polishing glasses, his eyes dark. "You're walking a thin line," he said finally. "Ghosts like her, they're not puzzles to be solved. They're wounds, and sometimes wounds don't want to heal. They just want to pull you inside them." "Then why ask me to find her?" I snapped. "Why leave notes? Why show me the accident?" Mark shrugged, but his expression was grave. "Maybe she doesn't want you to find her. Maybe she wants you to join her." The words landed like a stone in my chest. I laughed nervously, but my voice cracked. When I got home, my apartment felt different. The air was thick, heavy. I checked every corner, every shadow. In the bathroom mirror, for the briefest moment, I saw her reflection standing behind me. When I spun around, the room was empty. I couldn't shake the feeling that she was closer now. Not just on Archer Avenue, not just in my car, but inside the walls of my life. And I knew, deep down, that the next time I saw her, she wouldn't vanish so easily. The days after the flowers felt like they were stacked on top of one another in a tilted pile, each one threatening to topple the rest. I started leaving the lights on in my apartment, even during the day. I left the TV playing static at night because the white noise made it harder to hear things I didn't want to hear. I began to catalog everything. Every small intrusion, every misplaced object, every whispered memory that crept up when I let my guard down. I also stopped pretending I could figure this out on intuition alone. If a story wanted to be believed in the modern age, it had to be documented. So I went back to the records, this time with a different aim. Instead of hunting for the accident report, I looked for the people around Elizabeth Anders, the ones who might have cared enough to leave a trace. Old city directories are like fossilized neighborhoods. They preserve addresses and occupations and, sometimes, little hints. I found an Anders family in the 1930 census. Father listed as a machinist, mother with the faint notation née Caldwell. There were 2 children, Elizabeth and a younger brother, Thomas. The street listed for them isn't there anymore. It's been swallowed by an industrial complex, but the names were real. They had existed. There was a church registry at the Historical Society. Names, baptisms, a notation beside Elizabeth's entry, funeral service, Resurrection Cemetery. That was the bureaucratic confirmation that she was buried there. But it was an ordinary line on an ordinary sheet. What I wanted was color, letters, diaries, anything that would make her a person and not just a headline. One afternoon I sat across from Mrs. Hargrove, a woman who ran a small genealogical group out of the community center and had a memory like a library index. She was 81, her hair a careful white curl, and she smelled faintly of lavender. She'd grown up in the neighborhood right near where the dance hall had stood and had been a teenager when Elizabeth died. "You're not the first to ask about her," Mrs. Hargrove said, passing me a sheet of paper with handwriting that trembled like old glass. "People keep thinking the dead will explain themselves if you just prod in the right place. Did anyone ever say why she—" I stopped, chewing the end of my question like a bitter candy. "Why she might come back," finished. She looked at me the way an old woman looks at a photograph of herself. The town had a knack for not saying names in full. Shame mostly. There was talk that Elizabeth was seeing a man nobody approved of. An older man, married, who worked at the mill. There were rumors that she'd been kept from the proper dances, then let loose the night she died. You know how gossip stretches. People told themselves stories so sadness didn't look like the city's fault. Was there an inquest? A driver charged? I asked. There was a report. A driver left town. Some said he was drunk. Some said he never hit anyone at all and the story got tangled. You understand. When a town needs a scapegoat, the truth gets hollowed out. She tapped the paper. All we have are these scraps. Scraps were better than nothing. I took the copies home, hunted down the names, and called the last living member of the Anders line I could find. Thomas's granddaughter, a woman named Evelyn Anders who lived in a modest house with a porch swing on the far north side. When she picked up, her voice was cautious. "Why are you asking about my grandmother?" she wanted to know. "Because I think she—" I tried to explain quickly, the way you give someone a map without the landmarks. "I keep seeing someone near Resurrection. I think she might be Elizabeth. I found an old photograph." Words tumbled. I told her about the notes, the flowers, the vanishing in my car. There was silence on the line. The kind that holds signatures of things people don't say out loud. "Come by if you want," she said finally. "But know this. People remember, and some don't want the past opened." Evelyn's house smelled of lemon oil and dust. She kept photographs in shoeboxes and labeled them with careful handwriting. When she brought out a picture of a young woman in white and set it on the table, it felt like a sacrament. The face was the same as the one I'd seen in the groundskeeper's image. Elizabeth, poised for a photograph as if life were about to begin and time hadn't yet made the corners brittle. "My grandmother didn't get to tell her story," Evelyn said, folding her hands. "She was always, well, people used to whisper when she walked down the street. My mother never spoke much about her. There were funeral notices, prayers. That was the end of it for them. But then strange things started happening in our family. My uncle Thomas would have nightmares. He'd wake up and point at the ceiling and say a girl's name. He'd wander out at night. He'd see a woman standing in the yard. He moved away eventually." Evelyn's eyes showed weariness I couldn't name. "People in town told us to leave it alone." "Did anyone ever go to the cemetery at night?" I asked. "Some did," she said. "Neighbors, teenagers. Someone carved her initials into a tree once and it rotted. My aunt swore she once woke up to the sound of a dress brushing the stairs. We stopped counting those things." Evelyn told me one other detail that sat in my chest like a cold stone. Elizabeth's grave, she said, had been marked for years by a small marble headstone, but not long after the family moved away. The stone had been shattered. No one knew why. It was found in 3 pieces, like something had snapped it apart deliberately. The groundskeeper had repaired the site with a wooden cross for a while, but even the cross was gone at some point. "People think the cemetery itself doesn't like being reminded," she said, as if apologizing for concrete facts. That night, when I drove back toward Resurrection with the photograph folded in my jacket, fog curled around the streetlights and my headlights fell like pale knives. I stayed in the car and watched the gate. My breath fogged in front of me. Around midnight, a silhouette moved along the edge of the cemetery, the vague shape of a person walking the path inside the iron teeth. I turned my camera on again, pointing the lens through my rear window as if I could trap what kept slipping away. I told myself the camera would make the world accountable, that light would force things into being. When I checked the footage in the morning, my stomach dropped. The same smearing static plagued the video, but in one frame, one tiny, grainy instant, there was what looked like shadow fingers pressed against glass. The outline of a face so pale the pixels couldn't hold it. Things continued to escalate in small, intolerable increments. Random items in my apartment moved. A mug knocked over though no one had been near the table. Scratches appeared along my passenger door. 3 thin, vertical marks as if something had dragged a nail down the paint. Once I opened my fridge and found a white ribbon tied into a loose bow around a carton of milk. Neighbors started mentioning oddities in passing. Mrs. Valles from 4B asked me if I'd noticed the cemetery lights staying on all night, even when the office was empty. A mail carrier told me his dog would not step onto Archer after 10 p.m. An anonymous message arrived at my email. No sender, no header, just 2 words typed into the body. She waits. Fear is often a loud, clumsy thing. What frightened me more was how quiet it became, how ordinary the thefts and gestures were, like someone learning to live in your life without waking you. It made every shadow look like a doorway. One night, I found a note tucked inside my jacket pocket. I hadn't worn that jacket in weeks. The paper was not new and not old, somewhere in the middle, and the writing was dense with intent. "Forgive me. ****. The phrasing was arresting. "Forgive me." I could imagine 1,000 people who might say those words. A grieving mother, a guilty driver, a ghost repeating what someone else had said once they were too tired to go on. The note made my throat ache, because forgiveness invites complicity. It asked me, in the softest voice, to accept something I couldn't understand. I started to dream in fragments. The crash had become a looped film. Scenes would stitch into one another. The dance hall, laughter, shoes on a slick floor, a hand too rough on a wrist, a car skidding, glass like teeth. Between them came a quieter image. Elizabeth standing on a stoop, turning to watch a man walk away, her white dress flaring like a warning. In daylight, the city wore its usual armor. Delivery trucks, crowded L trains, people balancing coffee and their lives. At night, the city peeled back into older skin. The fog made a soft fence that muffled the world and let other things slip through. It felt inevitable that I would go deeper. I don't think I had a choice. Some people have the ability to step away. I was never one of them. Instead, I started assembling tools, recorders that would pick up midnight whispers, a stronger camera, a small voice-activated tape recorder. I read about psychical research, about seances and EVP sessions, about the danger of naming things. I also made a list of rules for myself. Never drive alone after midnight without recording. Never bring anyone unprepared into this. Never touch the stones. The rules were as much superstition as protection, but they were something to hold on to. On the 8th night, I parked by the cemetery and watched as if watching could become a profession. I had my recorder on the seat beside me, the red light blinking to show it was alive. Hours passed like a slow leak. At 1:03 a.m., a sound threaded through the silence on the tape. Low at first, like wind, but underneath it, a voice so thin I would have missed it if I wasn't listening for it. When I played the clip back through speakers, the voice coalesced into a phrase. A name, Elizabeth, and then, impossibly, my own. Daniel. When a voice says your name in a room you're the only one in, it rings like a verdict. I turned the car on with the same urgent jerk you might expect if the floor suddenly fell open. The recorder sat there, innocuous and mechanical, a small electronic witness. Outside, the cemetery lay in rows like stacked ribs. I knew then I was no longer merely looking. I had become part of whatever orbit Elizabeth had drawn around that intersection of mortar and memory. Whatever she wanted to do, whatever she wanted me to do, had taken on a momentum I couldn't stop with facts or photos or rational denial. So I made a choice I told myself was about answers. I decided I would go inside the cemetery at night. Not to be heroic. Not to prove anyone wrong. To listen, to see, to speak into the dark with the instruments I had bought and the small courage I could scrape together. I would walk among the stones. I would find a marker that belonged to her. And I would ask the questions the living never had the spine to ask. There was also a private thing pushing me, guilt, perhaps. If she had once been a person with a name, and if she had been hurt, then maybe ignoring her felt like a betrayal. Maybe I was trying to fix something that had broken long before I was born. Or maybe, more honestly, I wanted to prove to myself I wasn't the kind of man who ran at the first hint of trouble. Either way, that night I pocketed the photograph, the notes, and a small flashlight. I left the recorder in my coat and stepped toward the gate while the city slept and the fog that kept the cemetery company closed in around me, like an audience leaning forward to see what would happen next. The iron gate groaned under my hand, louder than it should have in the muffled fog, and for a second I thought about turning back. The city felt a long way away, its neon and taxi horns evaporating behind me like a dream dissolving. Inside the cemetery, the world had its own rules. Sound was softer, light sagged, and every breath tasted like old stones. I flicked on the flashlight and the beam cut a narrow path between headstones. The light pooled across names and dates. Mothers, fathers, infants, veterans with dates that read like another life. I kept my steps light, as if sound might wake the dead. My recorder was snug against my chest, its tiny red light a heartbeat. In my pocket, the photograph of Elizabeth felt like a secret I wasn't supposed to carry. At first it was quiet in the way that makes you invent noise out of nothing. A twig snapping behind you that turns into a footstep if you give it thought. I walked toward the section Evelyn had described, following a map I'd drawn from scraps and memory. The fog gave the world a softness, but it also hid things, which is the same as adding a rumor to the truth. I found the place by accident. A low mound, a depression in the grass where the ground had settled irregularly. No headstone, only a small marker sunk into the earth some years ago, the kind caretakers put on graves when a headstone breaks. Someone had recently pushed a handful of loose dirt back over it. The button of soil looked fresh, darker where rain had not yet lightened it. My hands were clumsy with the thrill of discovery. I knelt, fingers brushing the coolness of fresh earth. There was a shallow indentation, as if someone had disturbed the grave and then, in a rush or shame, covered what they'd opened. A rational part of me, old wiring from my construction days, said not to touch, that disturbing graves invites trouble from the living and the dead alike. Another part of me had never worked by rule. I scraped gently with my nails. The soil gave like bread breaking, Under the top layer, something hard clicked against my finger. I dug with a flurry, the beam of my flashlight trembling as if the light itself were afraid. My fingers closed around something small and metallic. A locket. It was tarnished, its gold dulled by years. When I pried it open with my thumbnail, inside was a faded photograph. The same face, Elizabeth's, pressed small and reverent against the metal. On the reverse was an engraving so worn the letters blurred, but I could make out 2 initials. J.R. The locket smelled faintly of damp and dust and iron. I sat back on my heels and felt like a thief who had been handed a confession. Why would a locket be buried with her, or near her? I muttered aloud to myself, and the sound of my own voice was shockingly loud in the hush of the cemetery. I put the locket in my pocket and rose. As I did, something shifted in the fog to my left, almost like the scraping of fabric. I froze. The light from the torch trembled. For a moment I thought it was only my breath. Then I heard the song. It was soft, like a radio turned down low or someone humming behind a screen. At first I couldn't place the tune, an old dance hall song, I realized, the same kind you might hear on a scratchy phonograph. The melody threaded between the stones, a slow, mournful cadence that made the hair on my arms stand straight. I turned slowly, shining the flashlight along the row, toward the sound. The beam landed on a figure at the edge of my light. She was standing there, pale and impossibly still, her white dress catching what little light there was. Elizabeth. Not the violent, bloodied version of the crash-struck memory, but the photo she'd kept forever in her locket. A girl as if posed, like someone waiting to be noticed. My throat closed. The recorder on my chest picked up faint noises. A breath. A whisper that could have been my own imagination. Elizabeth, I said, and the name felt like a bridge thrown across a dark river. She made no obvious reply. Instead, she lifted one hand as if to tidy a stray hair, and the motion was so human it hurt. A coolness brushed past my face, like the exhale of a person passing, and when it reached my cheek it smelled faintly of roses and old perfume. "Why are you here?" I asked, the words scrambled and small. She tilted her head minutely. The edges of her mouth seemed to twitch into a suggestion of a smile that was almost, but not quite, kind. Her lips moved and the recorder would later make sense of it, if only in fragments, the breath of a name, the partial of a sentence. For me in that moment, it was a feeling more than a phrase, like a hand almost touching but not quite. The flashlight flickered. For an instant the beam guttered. When it came back, the space beside her held another form. A man's silhouette, thinner, his features swallowed by darkness and fog. He stood a few feet behind her, a shape out of place. Too solid to be a trick of light, but not detailed enough to be ordinary. I couldn't tell if it was someone my eyes were inventing because my mind needed a companion for the scene, or if the cemetery had simply decided to show me more. My stomach rolled. "Who is he?" I whispered. The man's mouth moved. A low murmur escaped him, so low I thought it might be the wind. "J.R." The recorder would reveal later in staccato, static scraped syllables. Joseph Rhodes. The name felt like a small, sharp stone in my mouth. It matched the locket. Memory skittered into place I hadn't known I carried. A rumor from the historical room. An employee at the mill named Joseph Rhodes. Older, married, the sort of man who carries the city's decisions in his pockets and doesn't look back. Accounts hinted at arguments, at a flirtation with a younger girl that turned into a scandal whispered in grocery aisles. None of it was proof. It was, instead, a breadcrumb trail through the town's manners. Elizabeth watched me, eyes faceted like a fossil. Then, to my shock, she stepped toward me. Her movement was slow, deliberate, as if the world had thickened for her but not for me. "You found it," she said, and her voice was the soft scrape of pages turning. "You found it for me." I didn't know how to be anything but human, awkward, embarrassed, eager for anything to anchor me back in the world of the living. "Why?" I asked. "Why now? Why me?" She didn't answer in a way that words could hold. Instead, she reached out and touched my wrist. It was cold, like the inside of a freezer, but not unpleasant. For a moment the world tilted and I saw her life in flashes. not as a movie but as a cluster of impressions. A dance hall, men laughing. A hand on arm a little too rough. A car headlights on wet pavement. Glass, a thrown body. A mother's wail answered by nothing but city noise. Through the static of my recorder and the thinning of night, another sound rose. A soft, almost unanimous chorus of voices, words filtered through years. Forgive, find, remember. And then, startlingly, a child's voice that I could not place saying, "Don't follow." I tried to pull my arm away as if the touch might anchor me irreparably. The pressure on my wrist increased, not hard but insistent, like a plea. My breath hitched. "What do you want from me?" I demanded. Her eyes were immense pools. "To be known," she said simply. "To be found. To be." Her lips curved, and for a sliver of a second I saw unbearable hunger and intolerable grief. "Forgiveness. Forgiveness for what?" I asked. My voice small and foolish and utterly inadequate for the scale of whatever she carried. She didn't say it. Instead she reached behind her, and for the first time I saw that the man, I think Joseph Rhodes, had stepped forward to stand beside her. He was not menacing. He seemed haunted would be too weak a word. The light caught the edges of his coat, and I thought I could make out a face in the grain of fog. Tired, regretful, bewildered. "Joseph," I said. The name came out like I was testing whether it would taste familiar on my tongue. He nodded. "I tried to bury it," he said, and his voice carried the weary weight of years. "I tried to bury it and everything around it. But you dig and bones remember. You make room." Something in his tone told me that what had been buried wasn't only a locket or a headstone or a scandal. It was all the tiny choices people make that stack up and become a life and then a death. The city had been a witness that refused to speak, until someone pulled at a thread. The fog moved over them like a sheet. Elizabeth's hand tightened around my wrist, but now the touch was less a plea and more an invitation. "Help me," she whispered. "Finish the story." My rational mind listed 1,000 reasons to refuse. The list included staying alive, mental self-preservation, and understanding that ghosts are not customers to check off. None of them swayed me. The apology she'd carried in paper and whispered in the night, "Forgive me," had opened a wound in me that wanted to do good where I could. "How?" I asked. She nodded toward the east, where the mausoleum rose like a ship, its stone dull and pocked by time. "There," she said, faint as a moth. "He kept something there. He couldn't let it be seen. He buried the rest. It's the key." The man who was Joseph Rhodes, if that impression was true, looked as though he'd been waiting for permission his whole afterlife. "I cannot write what I did," he said, "but I can point where the truth sits. You must be careful. Not everything left behind is kind." As if to underscore his warning, the air shifted. Where I'd knelt with my hands in the dirt earlier, there was a fresh scrape in the ground now, as if whatever had been moved or dug had been moved further. I turned, and for a heartbeat I could have sworn the shadow of a figure moved 3 graves over, and then the light revealed nothing but stone and lichen. It was the sort of logic that ghosts seem to love. Cryptic, half-told, and heavy with implication. I felt like someone standing on a stage handed a dagger and told to choose a curtain. "Tell me what to do," I said, which is another way of saying, "Do not let me leave." It sounded dramatic to say it aloud, but there it was, the truth of my stubbornness and fear. Elizabeth seemed patient, as though I'd been slow only in the way a clock is slow while it wins. "Find the ledger," she said, "under the 3rd stone at the mausoleum. The brass is loose." A man hid what he could not face in ink and metal. "The ledger," I repeated. The image of a ledger, paper and snail gray, full of names and business transactions, was simultaneously mundane and devastating. Why would there be a ledger in a mausoleum? Joseph's face crumpled. "Your city has many pockets where men hide shame in ink." The ledger was his ledger, his list of favors and debts. He wrote, he paid, he controlled. He thought paper could fix the soft parts of a life. "Who is he?" I pressed. "The driver? The man who?" "He's more than one thing," Joseph replied softly. Men of means make small lives terrible. He thought he could buy what happened into silence. I swallowed. The fog seemed to press closer, hungry. My flashlight, which had been steady an hour ago, sputtered and died. The beam collapsed into the night. In the dark I heard breathing, mine loud and urgent, and then a chorus behind me like leaves stirred by a hand. I fumbled for my phone and the glow held for half a breath before I realized it too had gone dim. The battery icon stubbornly red though I charged it an hour earlier. The world had been narrowed to the volume of my own breath and the thin pulse in my ear. Elizabeth's fingers left my wrist. "Be careful," she said. "They don't like witnesses." When the light from my phone winked out altogether, something cold slid along my collarbone, like a fingertip tracing a name. My skin prickled. Now, I heard someone, not a person, but 80 years of gossip and regret, say from the dark. I told myself to move. I told myself to be quick and practical. I found the mausoleum by feel more than sight, a stone cube risen from soft earth. The door was closed, iron latch stiff with rain. I forced it open with both hands. It resisted with the inertia of long disuse and then gave with a sound like a held breath being released. Inside the mausoleum the air was colder still. My beam, when I could coax it back with a frantic jolt from shaking my phone's battery saver, caught on rows of plaques and names, brass plates tarnished and keyed with fingerprints I'm sure were not mine. I walked along until I found the third stone, its brass loose as Joseph had said. When I pried at the edge it came free like a trapdoor, the metal groaning. Beneath it lay a small cavity. Paper had been placed there once, tied with brittle twine. My hands shook as I unwrapped it. The top of the stack held a narrow ledger, its leather cover eaten by age. Inside, penciled in cramped script, were entries. Dates, names, small words that read like accounts of favors and payments. Some entries were banal, oil, $2.00, and some were darker, names crossed out and rewritten. A notation at the back of the ledger read, simply, A. Paid silence. October 31st, 1934. My blood went cold. The date matched the newspaper article. Paid silence. The words implied calculation, a purchase of quiet, a way to keep the city's face smooth by buying it. Underneath the entry someone had scratched a single line, "Not enough." I turned the pages more quickly, my fingers tracing the history of transactions like bruises. There it was, an entry that made my lungs ache. The handwriting was the careful spidery script of a man who keeps lists for a living. Names, addresses, amounts exchanged. Joseph Rhodes' name appeared multiple times, his amounts circled and annotated with careful initials. Next to the column that should have held notes, someone had written a place, "Resurrection, remove stone." I felt like someone who had opened a ledger and found blood where numbers should have been. It was proof, but it was also a map of the moral cost involved. Men at the mill, owners of small factories, people who had smiled at prayer meetings, paper pushing a stain into place. The sound of a footstep on loose gravel made me stop. In the doorway of the mausoleum, faint against the dark, a silhouette stood, tall, older, and far too steady in the night. I couldn't tell if it was another ghost or a living person who'd come to see what had disturbed the air. "You're meddling where you shouldn't," a voice said. It was not Elizabeth's, not Joseph's. It was lower, thick with years of being allowed to say what needed saying. "Why do you unbury things that time closed?" I felt a cold like an answer pour into my bones. My hands were on the ledger. The brass that had been warm under my fingers now felt like a hot brand. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice reverberating against stone. The silhouette stepped forward. The light found a face, older, lined, wearing a coat that had seen better winters. He looked like the sort of man who kept the city ordered, respectable, careful. For a beat my brain tried to line him up with photos in the ledger, with names on the stones. He shone with the arrogance of the living who think themselves beyond consequence. "Men like me prefer the past stay buried," he said. "They prefer it tidy. You pry, and something pries back. I should have left then. I should have wiped my hands on my pants and walked back through the fog to the mundane safety of my apartment, to the steady hum of a TV or a neighbor's radio. Instead, the ledger flushed heat under my hands. Whatever this was, whatever Elizabeth wanted, it had my name stitched into it now. I had started this, and the city had not given me the option of finishing lightly. The man smiled, not kindly. "You should go home, Daniel. This isn't for you." He knew my name. The sound of it, my name, felt unmoored when anyone not known to me spoke it. I realized I had never told him my name aloud in the cemetery. I had never claimed it for him. Yet here it was, handed back to me like a challenge. Behind him, the fog thickened. From the rows of graves rose a shape, no more than one. Like people standing very still and then moving as if pulled by strands. The air filled with whispers, so many that I could not make out a single sentence. Elizabeth stood at the edge of the mausoleum doorway, hands clasped, her face an unreadable mask. "Go," she said now, and it was not the entreaty from before. Her voice was tough as bone. "If you stay, you'll be remembered. If you leave, they will be forgotten." Something in that phrasing, remembered versus forgotten, hit me harder than any shove. With the ledger in my hands, I had a choice that felt larger than me. To carry the ledger into light and force the city to remember, or to close it up and leave the dead to the mercy of silence. The man in the doorway took a step forward. "You are not equipped," he said, as if listing a diagnosis. "You are a troublemaker in a city that prefers order." I could feel the fog pressing around my throat now, the cemetery no longer just a place but a pressure. The recorder in my pocket clicked on of its own accord, capturing the scrape of breath and the thudding of my heart, and then, faint and clear, a voice saying my name and a whisper that sounded suspiciously like warning. "Don't trust the living who carry paper." I looked up at the man and then at Elizabeth. There was an angle in the way she watched me, as if she weighed my capacity to carry this truth. Her eyes were not pleading now. They were feral with desire for an end. "Take it," she said, gesturing toward the ledger. "Take it where people keep lists. Make them read." My limbs shook. I folded the ledger against my chest and stepped out into the night. For a second, the man in the doorway, custodian or ghost, I could no longer tell, moved as if to stop me. His fingers grazed my shoulder, and the touch was cool as marble. "You'll be paying for this," he said, not as threat but as statement. Outside, the fog swallowed my breath. The headstones watched like a congress of sober faces. Elizabeth's silhouette slipped between them, a white thing that moved with purpose. Joseph stood just inside the gate, his head bowed as if in prayer or shame. I walked, the ledger heavy against me, the weight of names pressing through the leather like impossible seeds. Behind me, something rose and fell, the chorus, the city's memory flexing like lungs. I didn't know if I was brave or foolish. I only knew I could not leave the ledger in a mausoleum to smudge into dust. I had opened a ledger, and now the account demanded settlement. When I reached the gate, the fog thickened and something warm brushed my cheek. For an instant I thought I felt lips on my skin, a kiss or a benediction, and then the wind took it, and the cemetery fell silent as a mouth closed. I walked back to my car with the ledger in my lap, the paper rustling like small wings, and the city behind me resumed its indifferent noise. A siren somewhere, a couple shouting at one another drunk and fierce, a train far off. I drove home with the windows down despite the cold. The ledger sat on the passenger seat like an accusation. For the first time since this began, I felt the direction of my work shift. This was no longer an inquiry. It was an indictment. I had the names and the numbers, the ink that tied money to silence. I had also, I realized with an ache, become entangled in a story not only of ghosts but of the living who tried to conceal a wrong. When I unlocked my apartment and laid the ledger on my kitchen table, the house seemed almost unbearably bright. Lights too solid and furniture too real after stone and fog. I ran water and rinsed my hands, fingers leaving smears on the stainless steel as if I had soil under my nails. I stared at the ledger while the kettle screamed itself thin, and a thought struck me sharp. Once published, once told, memory cannot be returned to sleep. I sat at the table and opened the ledger again under the bright lamp. The names looked clinical and ordinary, but between them I felt a web. Joseph Rhodes' signature in several places, amounts paid, favors cashed. A name circled with a steady hand near the back. H. Marlowe. I allowed myself to breathe. I'd seen the name before in a photograph tucked behind an article on city council donors. Harlan Marlowe, a man who'd long since moved on to other cities and other reputations. I thought of Elizabeth on the roadside in the fog, of her hand on my wrist, and thought of the ledger as more than paper. It was a history, messy, bureaucratic, and very human. It was the kind of proof that makes institutions squirm and men with reputations sweat under the collar. There would be consequences. I knew that then, like I knew the taste of my own blood after a cut. I also knew I couldn't be the one to put the ledger on a desk and say, plainly, "This is what you must answer for." I had to be careful. I had to be thorough. I had to make the ledger impossible to ignore. Somewhere in the clatter of the city, one more sound threaded through my apartment. A soft scrape against my window. I didn't need to look to know what it was. Elizabeth's figure lingered by the glass, a pale, watchful presence. Her expression had an odd peace to it now, as if the act of being found was more important than how the finding would end. "Do it," she seemed to say without words. "Make them remember." I set the ledger down and took a breath that tasted like the graveyard. Cold and mineral and full of things that have no intention of staying buried. The church smelled of old wood, candle wax, and dust. Father Thomas led me down a narrow hallway toward a locked storage room where parish records were kept. He carried a heavy ring of keys, the kind you'd expect a jailer to have. "You're not the first to come asking about her," he said quietly as we walked. "Over the years, people wander in with their stories. Sightings on the road, voices in the dark. Most leave here more troubled than when they came." He unlocked the door with a creak, and we stepped inside. The room was cramped, shelves sagging under the weight of ledgers, yellowed papers, and brittle photographs. Father Thomas lit a small lamp, casting long shadows against the walls. "Elizabeth Anders," I said, my voice echoing in the stillness. He nodded slowly and began rifling through the shelves. Finally, he pulled down a box, its cardboard edges frayed. Inside were church records, baptism certificates, and funeral notes from the 1930s. He placed a folder on the table. "Here she is." I leaned closer, my hands trembling. There was her baptism record, her confirmation, even a photograph clipped from the parish newsletter. It showed her smiling, holding flowers, her eyes alive with joy. Then came the funeral entry. My stomach turned as I read the words, "Buried at Resurrection Cemetery, Section 12. But something was wrong. Beneath it, in a shaky hand, another note had been added, almost like a warning. "Body not recovered. Grave sealed empty. Asterisk asterisk." I stared at the line until the letters blurred. "What does this mean?" I asked. Father Thomas pursed his lips. "The story goes that her family insisted on a proper burial, even though her remains were never found. The casket was closed, lowered, and blessed. But according to records kept by the old priest, the box was empty." A cold chill washed over me. "So she wasn't really buried?" "Not in the ground," he said softly. "Her spirit never rested. That is why she lingers." I ran my fingers over the brittle paper, trying to absorb every detail. My chest tightened, my mind racing. This explained everything: the fog, the visions, the notes. She wasn't tied to a grave. She was untethered, lost between worlds. Father Thomas placed a hand on my shoulder. "If she's reaching out to you, it's not random. Spirits choose carefully. But remember, they can be desperate. Desperation can turn dangerous." I left the church with a copy of the record folded in my coat pocket, my thoughts spinning. Elizabeth wasn't just a ghost repeating old patterns. She was searching for something, or someone, and for some reason she had chosen me. That night, the knocking began again. 3 sharp raps on my door, the same rhythm as before. I didn't move at first, frozen in my chair. Then slowly, I stood and opened it. No one was there, but on the floor lay a third slip of paper. My hands shook as I picked it up. This one said, "Look deeper." The letters seemed darker, almost burned into the paper. I pressed it to my chest, my heart hammering. She wasn't finished with me. She was leading me further into her story, into her tragedy. Sleep was impossible. Every sound in the apartment seemed amplified. The creak of the floorboards, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant bark of a dog. Around 3 in the morning, I heard the faint sound of weeping. It wasn't outside. It wasn't in the hallway. It was inside my apartment, low and broken, like someone mourning. I turned on every light, searching every corner, but nothing was there. Still, the weeping followed me until dawn, seeping into the walls, into my bones. By morning, I felt hollow, as though I were no longer entirely my own. Elizabeth had dug her fingers into my life, and there was no pulling them free. I started by transcribing the ledger. It felt ceremonious in a way, like preparing evidence for a confession. I cleared a corner of my kitchen table, set up a lamp, and began to copy the names, dates, amounts, and the small notations that read like the margins of a morality play. Each name I wrote felt heavier than the last, as if the ink soaked up something from the room. There were names I recognized from faded articles and shaky photographs. Men who'd made careers shaking hands in rooms with smoked glass, owners of mills and storefronts, a councilman whose portrait hung in the Historical Society, a local banker whose family still had a corner office downtown. There were also names I didn't know. Clerks, drivers, a handful of women whose initials had been scribbled as if to remind someone of who they'd once been. At the bottom of one page, in a spidery hand, was a note. Keep her quiet. Cost, $200.00. Asterisk asterisk below it, another line, report filed, handled. I felt as though I had found a receipt for something you can't actually return. Dignity lost, silence bought. I scanned the pages, photographed them, and uploaded secure copies to a cloud account with 2-factor authentication. I wasn't going to trust paper alone, not now. The next move was obvious and terrifying. If I wanted the ledger to have power, I needed an audience that mattered. A journalist, someone with ink and reach. I told myself I would find one who remembered ethics and the thrill of a moral outrage. I called a reporter I'd seen on late-night pieces about corruption. A woman named Liza Hart who had a reputation for digging where others were polite. Her voicemail was full, but early the next morning she returned my call. "You sure you're not being contacted by a prankster?" she asked, voice clipped but not dismissive. When I told her about the ledger, the notes, the photograph, and the vanishing, she was quiet for longer than felt comfortable. "Meet me," she said finally. "Bring what you can. No melodrama. Proof. I'm out by noon." Her skepticism steadied me. I packed copies of the ledger pages, the photograph, and the locket, things that smelled and existed beyond story. Liza met me in a small coffee shop whose windows fogged with steam. She had a reporter's face. Too watchful, too tired, the kind of person whose antennae are always tuning for dishonesty. "You brought this," she said, tapping the ledger pages. Her fingers hesitated over the ink like they could smudge the truth. "You're sure these came from where?" "From a mausoleum," I said. "Under a bronze plate. I found the ledger and removed it." Her eyes searched my face as if looking for the seam where a play was stitched together. "And you saw a woman, ghost, who asked you to bring this to me?" I wanted to be indignant, but instead I tried to speak plainly. "Yes, but I'm not here for a ghost story. I'm here because names in this ledger match public figures. There's a pattern, payments and obfuscations tied to Elizabeth Anders' death in 1934. Someone paid to hush it up. That ledger is a record." She opened her laptop and typed like someone trying to insert a nail into a wall. "If this is a fraud, it's a good one. The handwriting, the paper, it's consistent with old accounting. But if it's real, it's bigger than a missing woman. It's institutional." Liza asked for copies. She asked for the chain of custody. She asked hard practical questions. Who else knew? Why had I taken the ledger? Could I be trusted with evidence and not with a narrative shaped by fear? Each question was a pinprick, but necessary. She agreed to look into it, reluctantly, and arranged to run a few of the ledger names through public records and archives. If these names link to descendants with political power, she said, we're not just talking about ghost stories. We're talking about consequences. For the first week, we traded emails and phone calls. She dug. I chased leads. Records matched. A donation here, a construction contract there. Lines of money that rippled from one name to another like connections in a spider web. The ledger's ink began to make the city squirm. Liza promised she'd hold the story until we had something unavoidable. Corroboration that 3 or 4 ledger entries pointed to modern people who benefited from silence. The night before Liza was to meet me with a list of confirmations, the building across from the coffee shop had a power outage. I got the message to meet at her office instead. She wanted to show me what she'd found. The office was a narrow place choked with filing cabinets and the kind of light that makes everything honest. She held a folder, eyes bright in a way that made me think of old-fashioned courtroom drama. You were right, she said. These names link to a foundation, a donor network, and a trust that still exists. She tapped the ledger photocopy. H. Marlowe, Harlan Marlowe, appears as a donor and as a man who quietly funded things the city likes to forget. He donated to the mayor's campaign in the 50s. There's a family foundation, the Marlowe Foundation, that still gives to historical restoration and to civic projects that tend to smooth rough corners. The words landed like gravel. Harlan Marlowe, Marlowe. The ledger had circled that name. My memory flicked to the photograph in the ledger, to the brass plate that had said H. Marlowe. The man in the mausoleum doorway, proud, self-assured, had been warning me. Men like him prefer the past remain tidy. I need to talk to someone who can confront them publicly, Liza said. But this is dangerous. We need corroboration beyond ledger entries. We need a document that ties payments to an action. Something that proves hush money was paid specifically to stop an inquiry into Elizabeth's death. We worked into the night. Liza called archives, libraries, and an elderly woman who'd been a nurse in the 30s. We trailed a thread through old legal filings and found footnotes that pointed to a name. A mill foreman who'd left town the month after Elizabeth died. The foreman's name was crossed out in a coroner's note. There was the faint stain of someone sweeping history under a rug. That evening, as we packed up, Liza lowered her voice. There are people who will not like this, she said, eyes locked on mine. If the Marlowes have kept something quiet, they may be aggressive about keeping it that way. Be careful. I left the office in a state of high adrenaline and low sleep. The ledger in my bag felt like a sleeping animal, documented and dangerous. When I got home, I left the apartment light on as usual. The white photograph on my dashboard, Elizabeth's face in the locket, glowed in the streetlight, patient as a destiny. I thought of Joseph's face and the weight of men who thought paper could fix things. I thought of the man in the mausoleum who'd said I wasn't equipped. The words had lodged like thorns. That night, someone knocked hard at my door. A single, deliberate knock, 3 beats. I didn't open. The sound came again, urgent, authoritative. My heart thudded as if it were trying to escape. I peered through the peephole. A figure stood in the hallway. Too tall, coat collar turned up, hands stuffed into coat pockets as if hiding something. I didn't recognize him, but there was a presence that made the air in my apartment change. I hadn't invited this door to open. Daniel? Daniel Carter? The man asked, my name spoken like a claim. We need to talk. I didn't answer. The hallway light threw his face into shadow. I could only make out the angle of his jaw and a hint of gray at the temples. He spoke again, softer this time. I'm with the Marlowe Foundation. We prefer not to cause alarm, but there are matters concerning the ledger you removed from a private location. The voice was calm, decently modulated, friendlier than it needed to be. I told myself to keep the door closed. My stomach sank with the knowledge that a man with resources would prefer conversation in person. The ledger had a way of attracting men who had made their lives closing things. I think you have something that ought to be in the care of professionals, he said. You could hand it over. We could settle this quietly. The offer was blunt and perfumed with menace. It was also irresistible. Whoever this man was, He sounded prepared to buy silence or to intimidate it into place. "You want it back?" I heard myself ask, because I was naive enough to think I could bargain with a shadow. The ledger in my bag felt suddenly like a live wire. "We are concerned for your safety," he said. "Let us assume the best for both our sakes." I considered calling Liza. I considered calling the police. I thought of the man in the mausoleum whose fingers had brushed my shoulder like a marble press. I thought of Elizabeth's whisper, "Be careful." I opened the door a crack. His eyes tracked to the bag by my feet. For a moment he was simply an ordinary man, an emissary with soft hands. He smiled with someone else's mouth. "Hand it over. We'll make sure no harm comes to you." Pride and stupidity triangulated, and I shut the door. I locked it, slid the deadbolt, and leaned against it, breathing fast. The man knocked again, then left, his footsteps echoing down the hall. That night I didn't sleep. I unzipped my bag and set the ledger on the table, breathing quick like someone holding their hand over a flame. The pages sat there, pale and honest, like a list of sins. I considered Liza's caution and the man's quiet threat. I considered the warning in Joseph's voice that not everything left behind is kind. I decided I couldn't hand it over. Not to him, not to money. If the ledger proved anything, it proved that silence had been a commodity. I would not sell out a dead girl to make myself comfortable. The ledger would be a weapon or it would be a trophy. I would choose weapon. The days after the encounter with the Marlowe man were worse. He called once, an anonymous number, left a message with nothing but a sentence, "Don't be a fool." I began to notice cars I didn't recognize idling across the street. A man in a plain suit watched me from the coffee shop 2 mornings in a row. Their presence felt like the tightening of a noose. Mostly psychological, mostly bureaucratic, but precise. Elizabeth's presence, meanwhile, grew less like a whisper and more like a tide. She stopped sending notes. She stopped leaving flowers in places I'd go. Instead, she appeared in my dreams, whole and unspeaking, sometimes standing at a window in my apartment, sometimes sitting on my stoop like a neighbor. I began to see her in places I did not expect, reflected in the black glass of a storefront, in the frosted face of a train window, on a stranger's collar catching light like a flame. Her requests became less gentle. In the dreams she would hold out a hand with fingers that looked like they could anchor me, and a voice would tremble. Tell them. Make them read. The ledger demanded an audience. So did my conscience. Liza returned after a week with enough to light a very small bonfire. Corroborated payments, donor records, and a series of letters in an archive that suggested that a payment had been made to cover expenses following an unnamed incident in 1934. The words were euphemistic, like trying to say grief without naming it. The connectors were thin but present. We drafted an outline. If we published a story, it would be a slow build. We would not accuse living people without evidence. Instead, we'd tell the pattern: ledger entries, corroborative donations, secrecy via foundation funds, a missing body, a closed inquest. We would call on the Marlowe Foundation for comment and give them an opportunity to respond. A responsible reporter's approach, a morally correct approach. The morning we were to run the story in a small local outlet, enough to start the press cycle without leaping into national frenzy. My apartment smelled like ozone. The whole place hummed with something like static. My phone buzzed with an email from Liza. The subject line read, "Hold." The body contained only, "they will sue. They will threaten sources. Maybe pause. Or go wide and force them to play public. Your call." I could feel a coldness in my gut, like someone had opened a door in winter and let the whole season into the room. My hand hovered over the send key on an email I had written to a reporter who specialized in exposing old sins. I thought of the Marlowe man in the hall and of Joseph's apology in the mausoleum and of Elizabeth's patient, feral plea. I pressed the send key and waited for the world to respond. That afternoon, a call came in from a number I didn't recognize. A woman's voice, measured, polite, introduced herself as Ms. Hargrove from the Foundation's legal team. She wanted to discuss matters amicably. The words were honeyed poison. She offered me a meeting somewhere public but controlled. The ledger, she suggested, could be examined and handled with care. There was the same offer implicit. Give the ledger back and nobody needs to be inconvenienced by the publicity. I thought of Elizabeth kneeling in the grass, of the locket and the initials JR. I thought of the ledger's thin line, not enough. I thought of the man in the mausoleum saying I would pay for this. I had a ledger that counted payments but never accounted for regret. I had a ghost who couldn't rest in a world that kept buying silence. That night, I left copies of the ledger with Liza and another trusted journalist in a secure place. I recorded 2 backups to a secure server and printed a few hard copies and hid them in places I instinctively trusted. Inside books at the library, inside the hollow of a tree in a park, mailed to a P.O. box registered under an alias. I did everything a person who knows a dangerous truth would do, hoping to outsmart men who prefer tidy pasts. The next morning, I woke to find my kitchen window open. It had been latched. The lock was not forced. There was frost on the sill, though the night had been mild. And folded on the kitchen table, where I'd left the ledger under a dish towel, was a single scrap of notepaper. I already knew what it would say before I opened it. Leave it. Asterisk asterisk. The handwriting was the neatest I'd seen yet. Calm, practiced, entirely unthreatening in tone, and therefore more dangerous for that very reason. I felt my throat go dry. Below the words someone had scrawled, almost as an afterthought, "We can make this not worth your while." I folded the note and carried it in my pocket like a live coal. The ledger hummed on the table like a secret that could not be kept. I found myself thinking of Joseph again, how he had said he couldn't write what he had done, but he could point. Maybe he had hoped that pointing would be enough. Maybe he hadn't understood that some acts compound. When I left the apartment that day, the city seemed to be holding its breath. A light fog sat over the river like gauze. I drove past Resurrection and saw, standing at the gate, a woman wrapped in a shawl who looked like someone waiting for a bus. She watched me pass with the slow attention of a person used to looking for patterns in the weather. For a moment I almost thought it was Elizabeth. Then the woman turned and walked away, disappearing into the anonymity of night. I started to lose track of where fear ended and purpose began. I told myself I wasn't acting out of heroism but necessity. If the ledger could name the cost of silence, maybe it could force accountability. Maybe the city could be made to remember and, in remembering, repair some small portion of what had been bought away. But that night the things in my apartment multiplied. Footsteps in the hall stopped at my door twice. Glassware was moved, though nothing had been broken. My phone vibrated with anonymous numbers. And in the middle of the night, when the city slept except for sirens and the thin breathing of the distant river, I heard the softest of sounds, the rustle of fabric. I opened my eyes to see, at the foot of my bed, the pale silhouette of a woman standing like a sentinel. She held something in her hand, a small, wrapped bundle. She set it on my chest and leaned down, and for a heartbeat there was the smell of roses and rain. She touched my forehead with cold lips and whispered a single phrase that was both a benediction and a verdict. "Remember me." I wanted to scream at her to stop, to leave me alone, to let me live in the ordinary small humiliations of the living. Instead, I found myself saying aloud, "I'll tell them. I will tell them all." She straightened and smiled. No longer the open wound of a phantom, but the satisfied look of a hunter who has found her trail. "Tell them," she said, "and take care. They can make paper into a prison." The ledger on the table felt heavier than the night air. I lay awake until dawn thinking of how much the city had been taught to fold history into clean envelopes and how dangerous it is to force it open. I thought of the Marlowe Foundation, of lawyers and men who could make trouble disappear like fog. I thought of Liza, of her careful hands, of the legal pads that would be needed to pry out truth. By the time the sun pitched its first light through my blinds, I knew what I had to do next. I would publish pieces slowly, methodically, with documented facts tied to ledger entries. I would force the Marlowes to answer, in public, to a ledger that had names and amounts and dates. I would call witnesses. I would make history noisy. And if that brought threats, lawsuits, men in hallways, or worse, If it asked of me what Joseph could not do, I would do it anyway, because the alternative was to place the ledger back under a stone and let another girl vanish into comfortable silence. The ledger sat on my table, waiting. Outside, the city carried on, unaware of the small, deliberate war grinding into being. I lit a cigarette, an old, ridiculous habit, and watched the smoke braid into the morning. The woman in white had a patience that felt like mathematics. She had found someone who could keep a ledger. I had found a story that could make a city look at itself. The only question left was whether the city would let itself be seen. Sleep became a stranger to me. I'd lie in bed for hours, staring at the ceiling, waiting for dawn, too afraid to close my eyes. Every time I drifted off, I saw her pale figure standing by the roadside, or worse, standing in the corner of my room, waiting silently for me to notice her. I began recording everything in a journal. Every strange sound, every flicker of movement, every nightmare. I wasn't sure why. Maybe I thought if I documented it, I could prove to myself that I wasn't losing my mind. One night, as I sat at my desk writing, I heard soft footsteps in the hallway. Slow, deliberate, one after another. I froze, holding my breath. The only other person in the house was me. The steps came closer, until they stopped just outside my door. I waited, heart hammering, but the door never opened. Finally, I gathered the courage to move. When I opened the door, the hallway was empty. Still, I felt it, that same icy air brushing against my skin. I decided to confront the legend directly. Maybe if I went back to the cemetery, I'd find answers. Maybe I'd see her again and demand to know what she wanted from me. It was insane. I knew it, but fear mixed with obsession, and I couldn't resist. The following Saturday night, I drove back to Archer Avenue. The fog was thick again, just like before, rolling low over the road. The cemetery loomed ahead, its gates tall and black, like the entrance to another world. I parked my car on the shoulder and got out, flashlight in hand. The air was bitter cold, and every sound seemed amplified. The crunch of gravel under my boots, the distant rustle of tree branches. Inside the cemetery, I wandered between rows of tombstones. The names and dates carved into the stone stretched back more than 100 years. My breath came out in white clouds, and the deeper I went, the heavier the silence grew. Then I saw it. A figure in white, standing near a large oak tree, just beyond a row of graves. She wasn't moving, just standing perfectly still. Her face turned slightly toward me. My chest tightened, but I forced myself to step closer. "Who are you?" I called, my voice shaking. She didn't answer. The fog swirled around her, making her shape blur in and out of sight. I stepped closer, until I was only a few feet away. Her skin looked almost translucent under the moonlight. And then she lifted her head and met my eyes. In that moment, every sound in the world seemed to vanish. The air froze, her lips parted, and in the faintest voice, she whispered, "Why did you bring me back?" Before I could respond, the flashlight in my hand flickered and went out. I was swallowed in darkness. I remember the night before everything broke open like a seam. I slept maybe an hour, fitful and watchful, the ledger under my pillow like a sleeping thing that might bite. Liza called at dawn with the last confirmations. Bank transfers, foundation minutes, a notarized memo sloppily worded that matched one of the ledger entries. She had interviews lined up, a legal safe narrative, and a plan to publish in stages. We would not hurl accusations without proof, but we would make the ledger visible, impossible to ignore. When the first article ran, it landed like a stone in a still pond. The local paper led with a careful headline, "Archive reveals ledger tying prominent families to 1934 cover-up." It was sober, factual, but the facts were teeth. Names were listed, documents summarized, quotes from historians included. The Marlowe Foundation issued a terse denial and threatened legal action. That was expected. What no one quite expected was how fast people began to talk. At first there were calls, polite, then sharp, then menacing. The man who'd appeared in my hallway left messages that transformed from conciliatory to flatly threatening when Liza pressed him for comment. Cars I didn't recognize followed me. Someone keyed my car. My mailbox filled with pamphlets praising municipal tradition and the dangers of dredging ancient, painful matters. And then volunteers started showing up at Resurrection Cemetery. Neighbors, curious teenagers, a small contingent from a historical society carrying metal detectors and gloves. Liza and I arranged for a cautious, documented search. We coordinated with an independent archaeologist and a representative from the Historical Society so nothing could be dismissed as vigilante curiosity. We filmed, we recorded chain of custody, we moved slowly because we had learned the hard way that haste invites both error and chaos. When the grave was opened, they expected nothing. Records suggested the casket had been lowered. Family lore said otherwise. The earth smelled of the same mineral damp I'd come to know. A promise and a warning. Men in gloves eased aside the reclaimed soil. Someone called for silence. They did not find a perfect body. They found fragments. Bit of bone, a lead fragment of a locket hinge, and a ceramic shard inlaid with the same faded enamel as the locket I'd found months before. The coroner's report 2 days later described them clinically, but to us they read like verdicts. The lab confirmed that the fragments predated preservation techniques consistent with an interment from the 1930s. The locket's missing hinge matched the marking on the ledger photograph. It was not the whole truth, but it was proof enough to make people uncomfortable in ways that money and polite denials could not soothe. Public outrage followed. A minor prod became a slow avalanche. The Marlowe Foundation's boardroom emptied as donors withdrew or simply did not return calls. Historical watchdogs demanded the release of documents and minutes. City council members, eager to sanitize their own reputations, called for inquiries. Lawyers read their pages late into the night and realized some things cannot be purchased forever. And there was reaction of another kind. The nights that followed the excavation were quieter in one way and louder in another. Elizabeth stopped leaving notes on my table. She stopped appearing in my apartment doorway. Instead, she was most often visible at the cemetery gate at dawn. A slim white presence watching the flowers and the volunteers with a look I eventually recognized as a kind of exhausted satisfaction. There was one public hearing in a municipal auditorium that still makes my palms sweat when I close my eyes. Liza presented the paper trail, ledger entries, bank documents, the coroner's note, and she read excerpts slowly, letting the words settle into the room. Families of men named in the ledger showed up predictably. Angry, embarrassed, politely outraged. The representative from the Marlowe Foundation attempted to show injured propriety, then fell apart when a journalist produced a photograph of the repaired headstone and forensic notes. I sat in the back of the room clutching the locket, the tiny photograph folded inside it like a fossil. When the ledger was discussed, the auditorium felt like it leaned forward, the walls listening. People who dismissed the lady in white as a ghost story watched as living men squirmed. Some denied. Some offered apologies infused with the precise language of legal counsel. None of it made Elizabeth whole. None of it brought back years. There was also violence. The ledger and the revelations invited ugly things. My apartment was broken into one night, but the ledger was not taken. An envelope arrived containing a single sentence in a handwriting I didn't like. Asterisk, stop tearing the city open. Asterisk, I learned to sleep with a knife under the mattress and a camera pointed at my door. Liza received threatening calls. Someone slashed the tires of the car she borrowed when hers was in the shop. We spent money we didn't have on security measures, but the truth had a stubborn, unromantic way of paying itself forward. The more we revealed, the more people who had been silenced felt permission to speak. Then, on a rain-slick Tuesday, something astonishing happened. A great-aunt of one of the men named in the ledger came forward with a box of letters she had kept in her attic. They were banal matters for the most part. Shopping lists, notes about sugar rations, a child's drawing. Hidden between them was one letter dated November 1934. It was from a woman who'd worked at the dance hall. Scrawled, fearful, and it named a name. A driver who'd left town so quickly that his belongings still lingered at the boarding house. The letter's language corroborated what Joseph's ledger had implied. Hush money, hurried apologies. A city that preferred closure to justice. Hattie, the great aunt, brought the letter forward in front of a camera and said simply, "We kept it because we were ashamed to say it." Her voice trembled. The auditorium where the hearing was held its breath. The ledger was not just a list of numbers. It was a history of decisions. In the weeks that followed, the foundation lost contracts, trustees resigned, and an internal review turned into a criminal referral for the records that could be proven. No dramatic courtroom scenes with confessions at first. The law is a long, procedural thing. But the city had been pried open, and its seams began to show. The night the ledger finally felt like it had done its work, though perhaps it never will be finished, I walked to Resurrection well after midnight. The cemetery had a new, guarded quiet. Volunteers came and went with clipboards. Police drove slow circles but did not interfere. I carried the ledger to Elizabeth's repaired stone. The headstone was new, carved by a craftsman using funds collected from people who wanted to make an apology tangible. The engraving was plain, honest. Asterisk Elizabeth Anders, 1914 to 1934. Remembered. Asterisk. I sat on the cool grass and opened the locket on my lap. The photo inside flickered like a candle in the dark. I pressed the ledger to my chest, and for a moment the world seemed to thin into the very air between heartbeats. She came to me then, not as a terror, not as a demand, but with the slow, final calm of someone who is permitted to set down a burden. "Thank you," she said. The voice was small, almost surprised to be simple. For the first time since this started, her face had no hunger in it. There was a softness, as if some great pressure had been relieved. "Did this help?" I asked, not sure whether I wanted an answer. She looked toward the headstone and the small gathering lights of people working to remember. "It helped," she said. "They remember. That matters." Around us, the city breathed like a thing alive. The fog that had once been a cloak seemed thinner, like a sheet being folded away. Joseph, if the man who haunted those nights was still Joseph, stood a pace back from her, his outline less rigid, as if something in him, too, had been eased by the ledger's exposure. "I couldn't make it right," he said quietly, voice a rasp through the stones. "But perhaps this is what I could do." The moment was not cinematic in any tidy way. There were no dramatic lights or sudden vanishings. Elizabeth smiled, and it was like a photograph coming to life for a single frame. Then she stepped back, and the fog swallowed her outline in the way fog swallows the edges of a page. The air felt softer, like a wound bandaged with careful hands. That night I slept genuinely, for the first time in months. The ledger sat on the kitchen table, heavy and ordinary, its pages a map of small cruelties and bungled consciences. Things changed slowly. Lawsuits were filed. The city ordered a review of archival practices. A small foundation that funded scholarships in Elizabeth's name was set up by a group of donors who wanted to give back in a way that didn't erase the past. And yet, I am not simple enough to say the story ended neatly. There are nights when the window of my apartment fogs from the inside, and I think I see a pale figure walking past the streetlight outside. Once, on a cold morning, I found a white ribbon tied to the lamppost by the cemetery gate. Not fresh, not wilted, but placed as though someone had left it for a particular traveler. I keep the locket in a small wooden box on my shelf. Sometimes I open it and look at the tiny, smiling face, and I am still surprised she was ever real enough to touch. There is an odd, permanent change in the city now, an awareness that the places we pass are layered with decisions, with transactions that are moral as well as financial. People who knew better speak differently. The ledger sits with me like a promise and a threat both. Proof that silence had a price, and proof that someone broke the habit of buying it. Most nights I go by Resurrection sometimes, not to hunt for ghosts but to see the names. I watch people bring flowers. I watch teenagers take stupid selfies by fresh stones, and an elderly woman trace letters with a finger. Once in a while, when the weather is just so and the fog lays its hand gentle across the grass, I'll glimpse a white dress disappear behind an oak tree. I am never certain if I see her, or if I only imagine her because I want the world to have been righted. In the end, the ledger taught me something brutal and quiet. Some ghosts will not move until the living do something they are ashamed to do. Speak, own, remember. Perhaps Elizabeth's piece was less supernatural than contractual. Maybe the ledger was only a ledger, and the right combination of names and numbers made people uncomfortable enough to open their eyes. Or maybe some things simply need a witness with a stubborn heart to make them true. When I tell this story now, I do it the way someone tends a small, tender wound. I do not expect absolution, and I do not promise clarity. All I can say is that once you start to count the costs of silence, you cannot unknow what you have discovered. You become responsible for seeing it through. Sometimes, on the quietest nights, I still feel the brush of cool fingers on my wrist, Elizabeth's hand as light as a memory. I close my eyes, and when I open them again, the street is empty and the city goes on humming. The ledger sits on my shelf, a weight I carry willingly, and the little photograph in the locket, her face, smiles back like a small, stubborn dawn.